Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are so honored to welcome Pandora onto our program today. She is going to be bringing her presentation that is called We Are the Ones, Applying Ecological Principles to Social Design. Pandora Thomas is a passionate global citizen who works as a caregiver for her two mothers, her Earth and her birth mothers, and globally as a teacher, writer, designer, and speaker with over 25 years of experience. Pandora's work is rooted in ancestral reverence and a connection between the human and non-human world. Pandora's work emphasizes the benefits of applying ecological principles to social design. Pandora, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Genevieve.
Hey, all right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everybody out there in the world of wherever you are. I want to actually start by appreciating Dennis and Genevieve and Christina and Seth and Anthony, just everybody, all of you who have dreamt this up. Those were the humans I'm appreciating. I'm also appreciating all the non-humans, everyone that put this experience together and invited me to be a part of this. I'm honored, I'm grateful, and I hope you all had a beautiful day yesterday, because I know today is starting off very blessed. I come to you from Berkeley, the land of the redwoods, of the stellar jays, of the newts and the salamanders, and of course, many different types of people. So yeah, my talk, Genevieve already shared, but it's called We Are the Ones, because I truly believe that no one is coming to save us. If anything, the earth's here, our mama, and if we can go back really deeply into her and each other, then we are here to save each other. My name is Pandora Thomas, and I'm just grateful to be here. Also, I have my cute little mom in the background. She's in bed. So if you see me turn my head, she's not one of the pandas. She's actually in the room with me. She's 81 and she has Alzheimer's. She is a priority. So if you see me turning, it's just me paying attention to her. But I want to start my sharing with you with this idea of Sankofa. And for those of you who've seen Sankofa, it is a West African principle, because as a woman of African and Native ancestry, when we are talking about the earth and the moment that we find ourselves in, this is not a time of newness, like, oh my gosh, we don't know what's going on. We actually have been geared up for this. We are standing on the shoulders of all those that have come before us, who have been connected, resilient, and working through things. So we're going to start this out. I want you to think of on whose shoulders do you stand? Who has inspired you to show up to something like this today? It can be an ancestor who is past, or even someone living now. You can be a blood relative, someone you've read about. On whose shoulders emphasize that we are the ones. We are from the earth, we are connected to each other, and we got this when we come together. I want us to, if you can, start sharing the names of your Sankofa in the chat box. Who are the people that you are drawing energy and inspiration from? We're not alone, y'all. And I love it because when I think of my Sankofa, it's not even just humans. My ancestors that I give credit to, the first is the redwoods. Any of you that are here in California or even in Northern California who've been to the redwoods know the blessing of these ancient, some of the oldest and tallest living beings. When I go to the redwoods, I'll never forget the first time I went. As a person with dark skin, I remember looking at the redwoods and seeing myself. It was like a reflection of my beautiful brown skin. And I'm looking at the redwoods thinking to myself, they are not judging me because of my race or my gender. They're seeing me as basically a redwood tree with some hair that's giving off oxygen, and it is giving life to me. So I have to credit these ancient, great, beautiful beings that have given us and continue to give generously without asking for much in return. But it's an opportunity now for us to give back in return. And then the other ancestor I just want to honor is my father, Lawrence Thomas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later. He is on the left side of the picture with the brothers posing in front of the boat. He is an ancestor. And then on the right, I want to start a little bit with George Washington Carver. Now, the reason I had to go back and Sankofa George Washington Carver is because, again, as a woman of African ancestry doing environmental work in the United States, as a young person, I didn't always hear about people that looked like me that were leading around earthwork or earth advocacy or even environmental design, agriculture. I did hear about George Washington Carver, but you know what I heard about him? He was the peanut guy. And I was like, okay, literally, like during Black History Month, the 30 days you study Black history, I learned that he invented the peanuts, which we now know is ridiculous. Because what George Washington Carver actually did, and the reason I'm starting out with them, is that he was a person that was the first agricultural professor of African American studies at his time. He was called by a brother named Booker T. Washington, for those of you not in the United States, to move to the South. Now, this is the South that had been farming cotton, had been forcing enslaved Africans to come and farm cotton, had damaged the soil, was having all sorts of economic disarray. Booker T. Washington learned about George Washington Carver, and he was this African American who wasn't just an agricultural professor, but he said that God spoke through him through the plants. So he had this deep connection to the earth. And so he was innovating on these ways of working with the soil that revitalized the soil, while at the same time helping people grow things that were needed to sustain our communities. So Booker T said, brother, can you come to the South? Because in the South, the earth carrying happening, the resource sharing happening, and the earth carrying happening. People are poor. We're damaging our soils. The African American community is impoverished. The farms are breaking down. So George Washington Carver moved to the South, started his own program where he was teaching a lot about what does it look like to not just farm, but take care of people, share the excess resources we have, and also nourish and regenerate the soils. So that's why I wanted to start with him, because those three principles of earth care, people care, and resource share, George Washington Carver practiced that. Although you might not have learned about that in permaculture, but that's why I had to go back and Sankofa the relevant experiences of my African American ancestors, that we've been doing this. We've been calling it different things. And now this is the time we find us in, where how do we presence the legacies that we come from so that all of us can really see ourselves in this movement. So a little bit about my story. My family, especially another reason why I shared George Washington Carver, is that both of my parents were born as sharecroppers in the South, meaning that all that we talk about of homesteading and living on the land and the abundance and making all our own clothes and butter and everything, my family were forced to do it. And I actually always say I'm going to shift the word sharecropping, because there was no sharing that was happening. My African American and some Native ancestors were actually, that was the only job they could get, to farm land that was owned by someone else. And then they didn't get to freely take the bounty of the harvest from the land that they farmed. They actually had to have side hustles and buy back anything that they farmed. So this started to have a rift between the very close-knit relationship that my ancestors actually had with the land, because they were farming it. It started to create a feeling of frustration and impoverishment. So that's what my mother was born into. But in 1941, my mother was born in Chiraw, South Carolina. Her and my family moved as part of the Great Migration North that many African Americans had. And they moved to Pennsylvania. They moved to a better life, the idea was, to a small steel town called Farrow, Pennsylvania. And that's actually where I was born. Farrow, Pennsylvania, town of 6,000 people. Now, the miracle to me is that even though my mother was born as a sharecropper, had that relationship with the earth damaged because of the way that they were treated, when she and my father got together and were in Pennsylvania, she still managed to raise me with a connection to the earth. I was raised going fishing. She grew everything you can imagine. Now, she, again, didn't call it, I'm raising you to be environmentalist or to love the earth. She just talked about, what does it look like to care for the earth the way it's caring for us? I went to the church. I went to church. I was an avid. We went to church every Sunday. I also went to Catholic school. So I also learned about caring for people, caring for others. There's actually some principles that you learn from religion that are very much linked to permaculture that I grew up just learning as part of my religious background. We also learned about tithing. What does it look like that whatever the earth and life is gifting you, you give back? So I grew up with earth care, people care, resource share, learning this just as a part of my ancestry. Again, was it a part of a design system? No, it was just how my dear sweet family managed to make it through. So as I grew up in a small, close-knit steel town in Pennsylvania, something very interesting happened. My father worked in a steel mill. And I'll never forget, when I was 13 years old, the steel mill that turned out to have employed 50% of our town shut down. The owners were having challenges, shut it down, and moved out of town. Now imagine a very small, close-knit town, half the employees working at the steel mill. This steel mill shutting down impacted our whole town. It caused, most of the people lost their jobs that were dependent on it. Many of the programs for youth that we had depended on, I even remember this, the lights went out in my town because we were having so much economic imbalance. And at the time, my community didn't know what to do. We were so dependent on this owner of this steel mill. My father, luckily, he'd been there 35 years, so he managed to still get retirement. But it completely broke down the fabric of my community. We did not have the wherewithal to organize and say, you know what? We're going to buy the steel mill back, and we're going to design something that's not actually killing our communities, because the steel mill was actually polluting the small little river in my town. We were dependent on it. We didn't realize that the very thing that was keeping our town alive was also causing damage. It might be linked to why both of my parents had Alzheimer's. There's several other issues in my community. So I remember at that moment, 13 years old, I was like, you know what? Something got to be another way. How is it that this one industry is causing so much breakdown, so much disarray in my community? And it's like we felt helpless. We felt like there was nothing that we could do. I also remember that was when a lot of the young people in my community started going to selling things that might get you arrested because they didn't have the opportunities anymore. There was no pathway to getting a job at the mill, and it was harder. So just that in my mind started this idea of what would it look like if a community could organize and bounce back after something like this in a way where we felt that we could do it. We have the legacy in us that we could do it. At the time, I was 13, 14 years old. I didn't know what to do about that. So when I went to high school and went on to college, I wanted to be the person that was like, how can I help communities? How can I take my passion for the earth and the environment, but also my awareness of justice? Because I remember that a lot of my Black African-American family were the ones getting arrested for selling the things that I told you was illegal, but my white friends weren't. It was definitely, I was starting to see the racial divide that was happening in the community. So I was like, what would it look like to be able to do organizing around the environment, but also around cultural and racial issues, but also around economic issues? What would it take to help empower communities to have ownership over that which feeds and nourishes us? So when I went off to college and I wanted to study that, there was no such thing you could study. So what did I study? Religious studies, because I told you I grew up in the church, and women's studies, because as a woman, I was also understanding how this was impacting me, and Black studies. And all of these things lived together in me, but there was no place that I could go and weave together and kind of design together in a mutually beneficial way all these pieces that had been impacting me from my story. But as I was studying in all of these different areas, that's actually where Terrence McKenna came into my life when I was learning about when I was learning about in my religious studies classes, different transformations that people were using. And then that's when I also learned about Starhawk, because the work she had done, she was one of the people that was actually starting to weave together. I also learned about some of my African ancestry, and that when we actually had better relationships with the earth, we were more able to organize and understand what it is that's impacting us and what does it look like to design a future together in a more collective way. So again, that was a moment where I was like, you know what? There's something in this kernel of what does it look like when communities come together, enhance the expertise that's already there, and how do we not depend on others coming to save us? Because no one came to save my community in Farrell, Pennsylvania. But when I wanted to study that in college and have a career in it, Again, no one could tell me what to do. It wasn't like there was a job that you could get that would just help you design communities to be resilient. You could become a planner, but planners didn't really work directly with communities and also didn't always have a connection to the earth like I knew that I wanted. Uh-oh, trying to move these slides. And then along came permaculture. And I learned about this design system that was actually rooted in ecology and indigenous knowledge that increased the ecosystem health while also meeting human needs. So when I learned about permaculture, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. It's asset-based. So it looks at what does the earth already have? What is already existing that we could leverage and hold up? It's not about bringing in a bunch of soil and pouring a bunch of water on the side and replacing the sun with it. No, it's actually start with how do we observe and interact with what is there? So it got me so excited because I was like, this is exactly what my community needed. And so many of our community needs. What are the principles that once we start observing how the earth works can teach us to reconnect with it and learn from it? But when I started going to permaculture events, there was an interesting disconnect. So much of the organizing was focused on the land-based pieces, and there wasn't that much cultural diversity. There was all sorts of other diversity, age and where people came from, and even some economic. But when it came to really talking about this idea that what permaculture shared with the world wasn't created by permaculture. This was actually, those principles existed in some of the religious things I had experienced. And when I studied women's studies, we look at some of the goddess religions. Principles existed everywhere. So I knew that a part of my opportunity on this plan, I think of all of it, is what does it look like to create relevant ways for people to see where their role is? What are the assets that exist in our communities, and how do we lift those up? Instead of focusing on the problems and what we don't have, and I always keep going back. I live in California now, but I have this dream of going back to my little hometown that's got less than 6,000 people now. But what would it look like to reclaim that steel mill that's now a truncated steel mill, but still doing the same damage, and reorganize my community to own it and turn it into a renewable energy factory and start to power our communities? So while I'm not able to do that there, part of what I want to share with you is a journey that I have been able to take with permaculture to really empower communities to see that we are the ones. No one's coming to save us, but if anything, the earth is asking us to slow down, observe her, and learn from her principles as we move forward. Because all of us have a piece of the solution, but we have to really create mutually beneficial ways where people feel seen and heard. So I want to start by sharing a video of the work that we're actually doing in Marin City of how we are applying permaculture in ways that really speak to the assets that a community brings. And after that, I'll show her a little bit more about how the principles are playing out in my work. So next you'll see the video. We're already experiencing these issues. We're already experiencing flooding. We're already experiencing displacement. We're dealing with all the fluctuation of weather patterns. We're dealing with the most vulnerable communities located adjacent to the shores having the brunt of the challenges. We're talking about everything from adaptation to mitigation to migration. What does it look like when you ask communities who have been historically underserved and mistreated, asking them to think about migrating? Can we avoid it? What does it look like? What does the development in the future look like? Resiliency planning, where their voices take the lead. We have for the last year been a part of the Resilient by Design Challenge, and it's an extraordinary challenge because what it's done is highlight the fact that the Bay Area is key to the future of resiliency planning. We visited and toured what they're dealing with and started to talk about what would it look like
community-led design.
You can imagine in the World War II era, the U.S. military kind of recruiting workers from, say, the American South, largely African-American, person of color communities, and recruiting them to the Bay Area and having a shipbuilding community. And then once the war was over, those jobs disappeared, and you have these temporary settlements with inadequate infrastructure that where the individuals who were living there were unable to move anywhere within the county or the Bay Area, sometimes literally by law because of redlining and categorical exclusion of either lending policies or land access policies. Now, take that circumstance and bring it full forward to now with sea level rise and extreme storm events. You have these communities who have been chronically marginalized over time at the front lines of these chronic stressors as well as acute events.
We were looking at the way our cities were being developed, and we noticed that the ideas, the dreams, the visions of the community were not truly being represented. The community was often included in a community engagement process where their feedback was heard, but at best that feedback was maybe integrated into an already established design trajectory, but at worst that feedback was often completely disregarded, and it seemed like the developers and designers were sort of going through the motions of community engagement. This leads to all sorts of apathy, disinterest, NIMBY attitudes, and even outright obstructionism of design projects. This has been a problem for developers, and we tend to end up with designs for our city that just really don't meet a lot of needs.
What we're fighting even right now with our own Board of Supervisors, with our own Marin County Housing Authority, what they want to do is come in and tear down public housing. What they say is, oh, we'll leave a couple of them, and we have to have affordable housing. Affordability in Marin County, you could be low income, and the low income is like up to $110,000. Who makes that kind of money? So what you're really talking about doing is eliminating your poor people and your low income people in Marin City, which happen to be, unfortunately, mostly people of color. We know for a fact that there are developers waiting in the wings. Marin City is gold to them. 10 minutes from the Golden Gate Bridge. Come on now. You have folks that's driving in here all the way from Hillsburg. Bumper to bumper traffic. Don't you know they want to live here? You know, but we do too. The relationship that we have with the Permaculture Institute group, it's a real relationship. It's a relationship that says, you know, we care about your community, and we don't normally get that from groups. We don't get the sincerity that people really matter. And that's the difference that we have here.
It's really unlikely that any community ever got together, looked at a piece of vacant urban land and said, hey, you know what we need here? We need more market rate development. That's exactly what's going to make this a nicer place to live. And yet, that's typically what tends to happen. In fact, it's exceedingly rare that communities ever get to actually participate in the design of their place. We need to begin with the foundation of planning that is by the people and for the people. That can serve as a starting place where developers, designers, and agencies can come together and collaborate with the community from the beginning. This is something we might call a people's plan. And a people's plan is truly inclusive, where the needs of everyone are met with nobody left out. So how do we create a people's plan? Well, first, it begins with a community partnership process. Through that community partnership process, we begin to assess what the needs, capacity, and the existing knowledge of that community are. From there, in partnership with the community, we develop a capacity building and eco-literacy training. That training includes both design and eco-literacy information sharing, as well as the toolkit needed to then take the people's plan after the training and continue it on in that community as long as needed. The next step is we begin to assess the place. We use maps, and we iterate through a process where people are placing problems that they have seen in the community onto the maps. Looking at the problem assessment, we then develop a set of strategies that are perfectly matched to meet the problems of the place and also the needs of the community. We then go back to the maps and we begin to match the strategies to the problems. We iterate through this process over and over again with as many people as possible. We then take all of this and we enter it into a database. Once we have it in the database, we begin to see something like a heat map. Once we see a strong pattern emerge, we can move any set of strategies into a rationalization process. This will allow us to determine the efficacy and practicality of any set of strategies. We can then vet projects and move them forward to further development. For small-scale projects, that might look like the community picking up shovels, building out small-scale solutions that can be replicated over time. For larger-scale projects, that might look like multi-agency collaboration where the community's role becomes advocacy for their own people's plan to make sure that what they need is actually developed.
Once they learned several strategies, they took a map and they just started assessing the problems. Here are some strategies. But the level of rationalization actually had them probe a little bit deeper. I may have placed 7 bioswales in this one area, but does that make sense? Let's start to go a little bit deeper. So what does the site look like? Is the bioswale the best strategy? So again, equipping them with the same questions that we as designers use, and then deciding what information is still needed. Cost speculations. All of these things they will continue to do in the future. And then eventually, all of the assessment and all the strategies have come together to form the People's Plan. So now we have 6 sites throughout Marin City that's a combination of maybe 3 to 7 different strategies they've learned in each site that can be started with. These 6 sites are not the only site that will be included in the People's Plan. We've talked about how the People's Plan is not static. It will live forever. So once you get those 6 sites built, then you can discuss and start to build and adapt and change over time and add more.
To create a whole system plan for any community, we must first engage in a deep assessment of place. Marin City is a small unincorporated community in Marin County on the edge of Richardson Bay, an important ecologically rich arm within the San Francisco Bay Area. Like many communities along the shorelines of the bay, there are vital transportation corridors. In this case, the 101 freeway provides a commute between San Francisco and the North Bay. This freeway has flooded in recent years, causing partial and full shutdowns of the freeway. This has also shut down access in and out of Marin City along the only road that accesses the community. Marin City provides us a concise watershed container to work within, with an approximate surface area of 350 acres. Along the shoreline at the lowest laying lands, a shopping center and the 101 freeway were built on what was once a coastal marsh. Between these two sits the detention basin, which has been receiving excess silt from stormwater runoff. Its holding capacity has been diminished and it is in need of being dredged according to the draft Marin City Flood Drainage Study published in October 2017. At approximately 200 acres, the residential areas along the foot of the hillside are a combination of public housing projects, private developments, and original homes built by an African American community of shipbuilders and workers who traveled here during World War II for work and to serve our country. A community-based assessment has indicated that there are numerous and frequent flooding issues at a variety of scales throughout this area. At the top of the watershed, we have approximately 150 acres of unmanaged regrowth forest that has been established after clear-cutting during the early years of development of the Bay Area. During our preliminary assessment walks, we discovered unmanaged erosion gullies and numerous locations where silt, large biomass, and debris were passing into the storm drain system. The combination of an undersized, aging, and poorly maintained drainage system, poor siting of infrastructure in flood-prone areas, and increased frequency and scale of storm events along with high tides has resulted in the escalation of impact of flood events. To address these combined issues, we are proposing a set of distributed, small-scale strategies based upon best practices already established within low-impact development. The community partnered with the students of UED Lab at Yale University to create draft renderings to be used as a communication tool to take any of these projects to next steps. For example, the commissioning of biddable specifications. Each of the following 6 sites may serve as a showcase of strategies that can be replicated throughout Marin City. First, we have a retrofit of the Manzanita Community Center into a resiliency hub, complete with an intergenerational garden, large cisterns, disaster supplies, rain gardens, and solar power for emergencies. A daylighted creek extends from the community center down to Donahue, along the edge of the school, and into an infiltration basin that is also connected to a series of bioswales along Donahue. The detention basin at the shopping center can be retrofitted with raised boardwalks and enhanced ecologically for education and recreation. An expansion of its footprint and dredging will greatly increase the holding capacity. The corner of Drake and Donahue is a critical intervention point for flooding. Rain gardens and bioswales and open spaces will increase infiltration and holding while mitigating flooding in the street as well as enhance the beauty of the landscape. The erosion gullies behind Building 69 serve as a strategic point to begin a pattern of restoration all across the watershed. An existing heritage orchard can be restored and replanted for the community to enjoy. The First Missionary Baptist Church has been flooded more than once from an overflowing culvert. A diversion drain will direct water around the church while neighboring green spaces can become showcase examples of resilient homes.
The rest of the Bay Area is ready for the on-the-ground expertise and talent to be the guiding principle. Because no longer is this idea of only experts coming in to save us and save the Bay Area. Now it's the homegrown expertise partnering with, other experts. But again, starting with the homegrown people, living with these issues, experiencing them day by day. They now understand a lot of what I understand in a very short time. It's been very empowering and reiterating something that I know, ultimately, that we all are designers.
We can change the agency side and the government side and the corporation side to see the residents as creators and as equals at the table. And so the People's Plan is a perfect way to do that. And I can easily see the People's Plan being something that is a tool to help the community leaders here and throughout the Bay Area.
I feel like it's a passing of the baton, and it's time for my age group and my generation to really step up and, take control of Marin City and what our future is. If we don't do it, then what you see now may not be what it, in the next 10 years. It might be, not Marin City. So I feel like I have to step up and utilize my leadership skills to, fight back and make a change for the better.
One thing that has me thinking differently now is becoming one with the raindrop and thinking of how would this raindrop travel, where would it go, what would it do, what would it affect, and thinking like that, not just for now, but thinking about the future generations to come. How would this raindrop affect now and later, and then coming up with ways that would effectively capture that raindrop and put it to good use so that it doesn't cause damage now or even more damage later. To me, that was one of the most interesting things.
Hello, everybody. So that was the People's Plan. I want to talk a little bit about how the principles are playing out that you saw, all of us Permies. So my favorite permaculture principle that I start with, and I also want to point out, did you notice you didn't hear the word permaculture that much in the video? We didn't have to use the word permaculture because truthfully for us, it's like, we don't really care what you call it right now, but we were applying and doing these practices, which again, are older than the 40, 35 years we claim it. This is stuff that we are bringing back from the past and making relevant today. So this idea of using on-site resources, determine what resources are available and entering the site on their own, and then maximize their use. So usually in permaculture, we think about the soil and the, what kind of, what ways is the sun hitting the site and the wind? What about the people? All of those people living in Marin City that you heard, Miss Terry, all of them, they are Marin City's best resource. We have to start with the resources in a community. And in order to really foster mutually beneficial relationships, more often than not, when you meet people where they're at, acknowledge and exist their expertise, that they are their own best resource, then they will be more excited to partner and really feel a level of ownership. So that's what we did. We started with, what are your experiences with flooding? What have you observed and seen? We did this beautiful 8,000-year-old story of Marin City where they learned that there used to be Black Panthers roaming the hills of Marin City. And then you saw in the video how we talked about the development, and they started to understand what happened, but they started to see themselves as the resource that's really needed, not just looking for somebody to come and save them. And so in any community we're working with, in anything we're dealing with, even with COVID, what resilience exists in our communities? How do we leverage that and lift that up and grow from there? Instead of being afraid and they're coming to get, no, actually, we got this when we come together and really start by community asset mapping. Mapping out the assets we already have, not only in the land-based communities, but with the expertise and the lived experiences. What needs to be done is already being done in multiple ways, people talking about it in different ways. Then that next principle, the problem is a solution. And, in permaculture, the whole idea of the problem of the wet sponge, you got a wet spot on your property, let's build a pond. Bob Marley said the stone that the builder refused will always be the head cornerstone. So many of the voices, the experiences that we listen to least are the ones we need most. All of the things that were happening in Marin City that were seen as a problem, they were like, the people don't care. They don't come out to the climate events. They don't show up when we do sea level rise training. Yeah, because the problem was not being named in the way that was accessible for them. Those same people that were not seen as part of the solution, we actually asked them, what are you understanding as the problem? And how do we start empowering you to be the ones to really come together? So often, if we just turn the lens on what we see as the problem and allow our communities to start exploring and visioning, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're vulnerable and disadvantaged and threatened. We need to start thinking about how are we actually the solution? Those of us who have been tagged the problem, because that's been me. I've been the vulnerable minority, this and that. What does it look like when I started to really say, no, how do I start with my assets and start to see where within the skills that I have am I actually bringing a part of the solution? And it's our responsibility in this time, because as I've been saying, and as Sweet Genevieve said it when I was over in the break, we all part of the solution. And then this principle of patterns to details in permaculture. So we use pattern thinking, and it was so relevant because everybody lives in a watershed. And the one woman, June, in the video, it was funny because she was like, I always thought a watershed was an actual shed on top of a hill where people stored water. Because again, what does the word mean? But when we worked with the people in Marin City and helped them to start to understand the pattern thinking of a watershed, and that we all live in a watershed, and what does a watershed need, and that there's repeating things and really making it relevant, then they have now started to think of every place they go, even their tiny plot of land as a watershed, the larger Marin City, other communities. So they start to think about the patterns that are needed, and then the details are specific. So what, again, are the patterns? And in terms of the social design, the patterns that when you equip a community to by first listening to them, and what does it look like to never just go in with, here's what I think, but what do you think? That pattern of thinking will allow an entrance. So then the details will arise out of the relationship that you have with the community. This principle, we hear it so much from folks. They're always like, what are patterns that are at play? And how do we start to understand the specific details based on the different example that we're working with? And then another favorite, this idea of small, slow solutions. Small, slow solutions don't always work. Because I'm going to just put it out there. In a couple of weeks, we need a big swooping solution that's about to shift a lot in the U.S. government system. I said, say that. But that started with small, slow organizing of people to come out and vote. Just had to say that. But in the Marin City example, we wanted to make sure that we weren't overwhelming people, because a lot of the adaptation and mitigation field is talking about large levees and just horizontal, a lot of big gray infrastructure solutions. We want small, slow solutions. With those of us in permaculture know those are actually easier to shift if something goes wrong. But actually those small, slow solutions are things that people can do with their hand. They can wrap their head around a bioswale or a curb cut. They've seen it and they actually can do it. So when we're thinking about small and slow solutions, very important with our communities, because you could also start with what small solutions are you already doing in your home? Like, how are you already saving water? How are you already saving money when you think about the food that you're buying? Small, slow solutions allow people to enter. And it also tends to allow more people to have access. When you enter with these big ideas, that's where people get overwhelmed. But this principle really plays out a lot for us because that's what the people keep asking for us. What are the small, slow solutions that the grandmas can take part in, that your mom can help doing a little bit of digging, Pandora? That's what we're really looking for. And then my final principle I want to share, this idea of how are we relinquishing control? So the Urban Permaculture Institute, the firm that I work with, we are actually trying to design ourselves out of a job. In permaculture, we say the role of a successful designer is to create a self-managed system. So you don't want to go to someone's property and be like, okay, you're going to have to carry the water from the rainwater catchment over. No, you design an irrigation system. Okay, then you're going to have to take a fan and start fanning no, that's why you design systems so that the sun hits the roof and then the panels heat up and they form energy and the water goes into the system and it goes and infiltrates the soil. This self-managed system, much like the forest, is what we're aiming for. Well, guess what? It's also what we're aiming for when working with our communities. What some of us call the non-industrial, the nonprofit industrial complex, which has basically created this cycle of we create nonprofits and organizations to help solve problems in communities, but then we have to constantly be working on the communities because there's no ownership. So think of how many nonprofits have been around forever with no end in sight, and there's no transfer of when do we succeed? Like, what would it look like if we started a nonprofit and we was like, we're only going to be around for 10 years and eventually we're not going to be needed? Now you have to have a lot of faith in the potential and abundance of the earth. You can't be afraid that, well, what job am I going to have? If we would have went into Marin City thinking, okay, how am I designing a job for me forever here? No. How am I designing an opportunity to relinquish control to the people of Marin City so that they own the strategies, they own the future? And guess what? They're going to keep hiring me because they already won't let us go and we're trying to pull ourselves out. But how does our work empower and embed the wisdom and the future legacy in a community? So they are self-managing and then we become the asset that they come to. This is a very important question for us right now, especially in the permaculture community, so we don't become the people that just become the tweakers, constantly coming in to fix stuff. No, we are empowering our community to see ourselves, our connection to the non-human world, to understand the systems that are at play. And then trust me, there will be a role for all of us, mainly because we all live in a community and our own communities are going to need us. But what will it look like as we start to really empower folks on the ground, most vulnerable to everything we're working with, to be the ones that take it over? It's the takeover approach, relinquishing control. This is the hardest, and I don't have answers. And yes, I have been a part of the non-industrial complex. I'm going to acknowledge that. But I have a goal that's not what we're designing for the future. We're designing something that lives in the communities that things are started with. So this is one more example of a project I want to share that's like the culmination of how all the principles that I've shared come into play. So you saw Marin City, and I'm available to answer any questions. We're going to share the video with you. You can email me. It's still going. It's beautiful, amazing. If you want to volunteer, let me know. But this program, Healthy Parks, Healthy People, so HPHP is a program all over the world. And part of Healthy Parks, Healthy People is the idea that the one thing that exists in every city and everywhere is a park. Everywhere you go, it don't even matter. In fact, those of you in the Bay Area in San Francisco, there is an area called Bayview Hunters Point, and it traditionally used to be the African American community. PG&E had their plant there. There was a lot of issues around that, but Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco alone has 14 parks. So healthy parks, healthy people thought, you know what? In this move to reconnect people to the earth and to the environment, let's start with what everybody has access to, parks. And as an aspect of the HPHP program, doctors came together and said, you know what? We realize that the health of people is not just going to the parks, but we can actually start to prescribe a certain type of relationship with the outdoors. So they started something called park prescriptions. Because as many of us who dig our hands in the soil know, it's been scientifically proven, although I'm like, we really had to have science prove that putting your hand in the soil is healthy, but they did, that more time in nature, more time connecting with the earth actually makes you healthier. So HPHP and park prescription came together and they said, you know what would it look like if as we were prescribing people to spend time in the parks, they actually were also learning about the health benefits and just becoming more environmental advocates. What the challenge was, however, was as young people and certain groups were prescribed time in the park, they weren't taking advantage of it. People are spending time in parks and in Bayview Hunters Point, but not spending some of the quality time that we're thinking of that the doctors wanted for the park prescriptions. But guess who was spending time in the parks? A lot of the elders from the South, not just African Americans, but these beautiful women. It turned out we did community asset mapping of who was actually in the parks. It was elders. And they were not only in the parks, they were spending the type of quality time in the parks. And they were the ones that when they got park prescriptions, go spend 30 minutes, blah, blah, blah in the park, they would actually do it. So I worked with one of these doctors. Her name's Dr. Nusheen Razani, and she's from Iran. And the reason I'm pointing out her ethnicity is because she came to the US from Iran and she said everything that she learned and did in Iran was based on the cycles of nature and was based in the earth. And they all the time did this. So she said, Pandora, what if we, based off of the assets we've already seen, our park attendees in Bayview Hunters Point are seniors. What if we train the seniors up on a few more health benefits, then stipend them, keyword, paid them for their expertise to recruit peers and the younger generation, because there also used to be this thing that when an elder told you to do something, the young people listened. I don't know if that exists anymore, but we went off of that assumption that if the grandmama or the grandpapa or just an elder told you something, you would do it. So we trained up these elders, linked them to the park naturalists, and they became the ongoing recruitment and participation. Again, relinquishing control. We didn't design something that I had to work with forever. Machine had to work with forever. We literally leveraged the existing asset that Bayview Hunters Point had. All these, look how durable they are, elders already spending time. We harvested the expertise and lived experience and relinquished control to our elders. And this is them at the training where they just learning how, they're not learning how to walk in the park, but we were stopping, smelling things, identifying different habitats in the park, some of the wildlife, just really beefing them up so that they started to see themselves as the ones that were the recruits. And guess what? They now own this program. I don't even have to work with it anymore. They have done so successful. So did you hear the word permaculture in any of that? No, we didn't call it a permaculture program. We called it seeds because they like that. And there's some acronym with the seeds, but I've already forgot it. I could tell you it later. But again, we can apply permaculture without shoving permaculture down people's throats. But the principles, the essence of permaculture that we know is what our communities really need to come together. Taking it back to thinking about my time in Pennsylvania, I can't help but think, what could it look like? I could have organized and worked with the communities, but that's okay. As you can see, I'm doing it now. But this is the opportunity for all of us. How do these principles play out in our lives? How can we use the on-site resources we have access to? Another thing, people are always like, well, Pandora, I want to come and volunteer with the seniors you're working with or the vulnerable communities. I always say, What community do you already have access to? I appreciate it, but I'm not sure we need you right now as someone next to you needs you. Who are the communities you have access to? Because all of us are near communities that are doing things, but that need us. So on-site resources of where are you and how do you ground in the movements relevant to your location? How are we turning problems into solutions? In the community organizing we're doing, but even in our own lives. How are we seeing that the patterns that we are advocating for can empower communities to learn the larger societal patterns that we're shifting, and then the details, again, get specific to the sites and the communities we're working with? What are the small incremental solutions that we know our communities can actually wrap their heads around and get on top of because it's rooted into stuff they're already doing? And then the hardest, I've admitted it, y'all. I ain't got an answer to the nonprofit industrial complex, but if anybody does, I give you permission to reach out to me. How are we relinquishing control? So we are not designing ourselves into having to save people. Actually, we're relinquishing control to the earth and her communities and knowing that we got this because we are of the earth and she's given us everything we need to make it. So designing for symbiosis. I told you, I was like, I'm gonna fit symbiosis, the word, in my presentation somewhere. How can you integrate the social applications of ecological principles into your life, into your love, because we gotta do it in love, y'all. We need to love, and into your work, to ground in mutually beneficial relationships between you and those that serve you. How can the people we are being of service to not feel tokenized, not feel like you're picking their brain, farming information, but actually feel like you are partnering with them, meeting them where they're at, leveraging the opportunities that exist within us all. So where you can find me doing all of these things, I'm a fellow at Movement Strategy Center, and most of the work we're doing is on what we call community-driven resiliency planning, communities driving planning. So as opposed to the planners that I actually went to college to be parachuting in, no, we are nurturing the grassroots, on the ground expertise. So I'm a fellow there, co-owner of the Urban Permaculture Institute. We're in San Francisco. I am with my cats. That's BB Queen on the left, Back Beauty Queen, and Graybeard on the right. And then the most important, that woman, Frances Thomas with the heart. She's actually in bed. She's still sleeping because it's Sunday, her rest day. I'm her care partner, I should actually say, because she cares for me just as much as I care for her. So I appreciate you for the time that you've given me. Again, y'all, it's us. What are your assets? Really focus on that because we can come together and do this collectively. Thank you and have a beautiful week. And there are all the ways that you can find me. Bless you. So if people have a question, maybe you can put it into the chat box.
I've got a question. It's Annalise here, one of the team. Could you speak a little bit more about how people could directly, if people wanted to come and speak to you and say, I want to work with you and your project, how could you then direct people kindly towards turning around and saying, okay, how can I then take this into my communities?
Annalise, with her sweet voice, how sweet you are. I want to meet you in that sweet voice. Asked, you know, when someone does come and say, oh, I want to volunteer with you. I used to work in prisons and people always would be like, I want to help formerly incarcerated people. And so I would start with, do you know any formerly incarcerated people? So your question was, how do you gently say to people, how do you start with your own community? And I'm a very upfront person. I tend to ask questions like, well, you know, who are the communities that you're connected to right now? What are you passionate about? What work have you been doing? Have you been working with youth? Because I also think it is very important that, oh, sorry, my alarm, that I'm not the person that says you can't move places and work with people, but there's a way. So even if, say, you move somewhere and you want to help the reentry program, I would say start by observing and listening. What is already happening around the reentry? Who is already doing things? So doing your own version of a community asset mapping, because people are doing things. They might be using different language, but I encourage people to not just kind of parachute in and think you have to save the day, but start by listening, asking questions, and just being an observer, which permaculture tells us, and then information will arise. And then I'm also a firm believer in the universe. I'd be like, universe, can you guide me to the best way to be of service to this existing work that's happening? Pandora is not the savior. Pandora is an integral part, a symbiotic part of this process, empowering all to feel seen and heard.
Wow, Pandora, that's a really fantastic response. I'm just so grateful for what you've been sharing with our community and the way that you brought it home, the way that we're all citizens of the earth. We all have these so many respective ways and all of our ancestry that link into how permaculture, and how we don't even have to say it's permaculture, and how that it paths a way for some guidance in this time where we're kind of midwifing the old ways into the future ways. But it's one of the strategies that's really helpful for us during this time. That's why I feel it's so important for all of us, and it's so accessible because it's already in our DNA and in our blood. It's already, we know it. It's not unfamiliar. It's common sense, isn't it?
So next up, I get to talk with my sister, my mama, Starhawk, for everyone that can hear me. So thank you for your patience.
We are the ones, we are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones, we are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones, we are the ones, we've been waiting. 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 We are the ones, we've been waiting.
Thank you so much, Pandora. That was such a deeply inspiring talk, and I appreciate you so much bringing in this very important social aspect and weaving in justice with earth care. It's an honor to have your presence in the space. And next up, we will be welcoming in a conversation between Pandora and her mentor, Starhawk. Let me bring you both into the space.
Hi.
All right, thank you, ladies.
Hi. Hi. Thank you, Genevieve. So, Star, here we are, my dear sister.
Here we are, just you and me and the pandas.
You, me, and the pandas, however many hundreds of people are zooming in.
Yeah.
So, Star, I shared a little bit about how you your writing inspired my journey a bit, but I know I love hearing about your journey. So can you talk about this journey you had as a writer and a designer? Because that's what's so creative about your experiences.
Sure. I mean, first, I guess I should say I'm the director of Earth Activist Training, which teaches permaculture design with a grounding in spirit and a focus on organizing and activism. I'm also an author. I've written 13 books. Well, those are the ones that have been published. We won't talk about the other ones. Including The Fifth Sacred Thing, which is in some ways a kind of permaculture vision of the future, and The Empowerment Manual, which is about group dynamics and social permaculture, and The Earth Path, which is about the spirit and earth connection. And the way I got there, you know, I was raised in a Jewish family with that background. I'm still very connected to that heritage. But in the 60s and 70s, as women began searching for ways to empower ourselves more and becoming critical of the patriarchal structures around us, I got very involved in the feminist movement. I also was kind of a hippie, which frankly was really a lot of fun. Probably more fun than being a feminist, but don't tell anyone. Yeah. And, you know, exploring all kinds of different forms of spirituality and consciousness. And they came together around, you know, a movement of looking at the roots of patriarchy and saying, is there anything different? You know, have all cultures always been male dominated, or have there ever been other cultures? And we discovered that, first of all, of course, there are many, many indigenous cultures still alive and thriving on this planet where women have power in a different way than they do in a patriarchal system. And then we went back and looked at the roots, even in European culture, Middle Eastern culture. If you go back far enough, you find that the very beginnings of what we call civilization started with groups that lived close to the land, because of course there wasn't any alternative, right? And that saw the sacred as being these great forces of birth, growth, death, and regeneration, and often portrayed them as a goddess, as female, and saw female power as beneficent and life-giving. And I actually saw male power as beneficent and life-giving, right? And the shift really came as cultures got more complex, as there was more opportunity for conquest and enslavement of other people to create hierarchical societies. As society got more stratified, then along with that gradually came this focus on men having power over women, and one group having power over other groups, and societies based on slavery, based on conquest and war. And that's really still the world that we're living in today. So I had been researching and writing about this and involved with people who were trying to revive that ancient life-centered spirituality and learn from the remnants that were left to us and go back to the roots of our heritage. And as part of doing that, I encountered some people who'd taken some permaculture courses. This is back in the 80s, right? And the early 90s. And I got very interested, did a lot of reading and research when I was writing my novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing. And then met Penny Livingston Stark, who's a wonderful permaculture teacher and designer. And she invited me to co-teach a class. And I said, well, I don't know anything about permaculture. Like, that's okay, I can teach that. You teach the woo-woo spirituality stuff. So that's what we did. That was in 97. I got my PDC then, and I've been doing it ever since. in November of 1999, I was also always an activist because to me, I always felt like if you believe that the earth is sacred, you couldn't just sit back on your bum and let idiots destroy her. You had to do something about it. And if you believe that, every human being is an embodiment of the divine, then you couldn't just sit back when one group of people are oppressing another and let that happen. You had to be an agent of justice. So I had always been an activist my entire life. And in '99, there was a big blockade in Seattle against the World Trade Organization, which was doing a lot of undemocratic things like taking laws that we passed and saying they were unfair restraint of trade, things like laws limiting child labor, environmental laws. So there was a big blockade that included labor, included massive numbers of affinity groups and activists, of all sorts, from Quaker pacifists to young, anarchist forest defenders. And Penny and I both were there separately, but we were both there as part of that. And it was a radicalizing, moment. Even though I kept saying, when we were in jail, people would say, this is a radicalizing moment. And I was like, yeah, but I already was radicalized. What's going to happen to me? And one of the things that happened to me was that afterwards, Penny and I were talking, and I was saying, God, there's these young activists that are just on fire with wanting to change the world, but they often don't have a clear idea of what they want to change it into. And there's all these wonderful permaculturalists and natural builders and people have these great solutions, but they often seem a little naive about the structures of power that are keeping those solutions from getting put into place. So we formed Earth Activist Training to basically teach permaculture to activists and activism to permaculturalists, and to try to bring the tools and skills of permaculture to the communities that were really on the front lines of struggle and that needed them. And so I've been doing a lot of that ever since. And
thank you for that. And then that actually leads to the story of how we met. Can you share a little bit of how we met and what sparked our journey together?
Yeah, we met first at a women's permaculture convergence that was organized by a group of women who were looking around saying, like, there's a lot of amazing women doing stuff in permaculture, but most of the teachers seem to be men. Most of the stars, the people who get all the attention, seem to be the guys with the big machines. And, I love the guys with the big machines. I think, right? I think that is why the goddess created men and testosterone, so they can take big machines and sculpt the land to hold water and regenerate it. It's fantastic. But there are some gals that could drive big machines too. And there are women who are doing amazing things that need to get more recognition and then have a lot to bring to the permaculture world. So we had this convergence. I remember you were coming. Earth Activist Training had been doing a program in Bayview Hunters Point, which is I
talked about that in my talk, exactly.
Yeah, the Black community in San Francisco, or at least at the time, it was the remains of the Black community. Still is kind of whatever is left in San Francisco is there. And working with students who were in public housing. And one of our teachers, beautiful young woman named La Diamond, I brought her up to be part of the convergence, and she brought her 2 little boys. We had this amazing day going up there. I took her to see Eric Olson, who's an amazing permaculture designer and teacher, and had a little boy around the age of her kids so they could play. We stopped off at the redwood forests because, I'd been teaching this PDC. We had something like 15 students in it from public housing, and not one of them had ever been to a redwood forest. And they all lived in San Francisco, in the middle of redwood country. Many of them had never been to the ocean. You know, it's hard to, I think when people have a certain level of privilege in our lives, it's hard to really conceive of how constricted life can be when you don't have that privilege. So we went up to this, there's an amazing old growth forest near us called Armstrong Woods. And I just remember those two little boys running and running and running. It was like this energy that just got unleashed and running through these giant, giant trees. And one of them turning around and looking at me and saying like, this is the bestest day of my entire life. So La Diamond was there, you were there, we looked around, and I don't think there was another person of color in the whole convergence.
Nope.
And that kind of reflected the permaculture scene at the time. And we connected there and started talking. And then I remember another convergence, I think it was a couple years later, that was in the East Bay at an ashram that Amma, this beautiful permaculture designed place. And again, it was like Jeff Lawton was there, Nadia Lawton was there, some big permaculture stars. But we looked around and I think, you know, I don't even remember if there's another Black person there. You know, Carmen Gonzalez was there. There were a couple maybe Native American people there. And we were like, what? You know, how do we even bring this up in the permaculture world? And I said, well, maybe we just do a skit at the talent show. And we did a sort of almost a comedy routine where I was the naive white person saying like, Pandora, like, why don't any Black people care about the environment?
Right, yeah.
Pandora, can I touch your hair? Pandora, can you bring some people of color and youth to our gathering tomorrow? Right, you know, like all the things that you hear. And it was painful, but I think it got something across. But after that, I mean, Earth Activist Training had been doing this program because we had said, okay, we would like the permaculture movement to be more diverse, and it's not. But we can't just go like dragging people off the street saying like, you're the right color, you know, come, you'll make our program look good.
Right, that's part of the reason.
Yeah,
I went to a few of those and I was like, I'm not gonna just invite all the Black and brown folks because it's not necessarily safe because of the kinds of crazy shenanigans that you share. Yeah. But there were all sorts of Black and brown folks already gathering, doing things, but it was just disconnected. So that was another important piece that Earth Activist Training started to make a bridge. But go ahead.
And it's one of the permaculture principles that we value diversity, that diversity brings resilience, but that diversity is diversity of functional relationships.
Absolutely.
It's not just, you know, it's not like putting a cactus in the middle of your redwood forest, right? It's about looking at what's the real relationships here. And I think that really holds true with people. So we started talking, and I think it was shortly after that, we ended up with some unexpected grant money one year. And I said, well, we're going to try and see what happens for our PDC if we just offer diversity scholarships for people of color. Mm-hmm. And because we actually had relationships that we had built in the Bayview, we had people who knew us, who wanted to come, and who brought in other people. You know, we had 5, 10 people of color taking our course, and that made a huge difference. And some of them went on, you know, we worked at mentoring, like you and other amazing, you know, some amazing people who were there, and we've continued doing that for 7 or 8 years now. And I just remember the last convergence we had in the Bay Area was a couple of years ago, looking around and going, this place is now filled with people of color. And they're giving workshops, and they're on the organizing committee, and they're giving talks. and they're getting respect and they have a voice. And many of them came through Earth Activist training. And we've made a real conscious effort to mentor, to bring into teaching people who are coming from those communities that so often are the ones really on the front lines of these environmental justice struggles.
And I just want to honor you too and appreciate that story, Star, because part of the reason when we did meet, and I was exhausted at that first, I was just like, okay. But I love permaculture so much and I wanted to be in the Redwoods, so I went. But I was just like, Lord have mercy. And I'd been used to being in all whatever groups of in homogenous groups, me being a different whatever. But you actually had the relationships to back expanding the network. And I think that's important because when you, like you said, just offering scholarships, I mean, people of color have money too. It's like scholarships not equal diversity. It's a factor and it can help. But the relationships and the trust, Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote Emergent, I forget her name, but she says that community moves at the speed of trust. And you've nurtured these relationships across so many different groups. So I think that's a real big takeaway that when I think about how Earth Activist training has then started to heal and bring folks together because there was trust in you.
And I would say for people who are asking these questions, saying, what do we do to bring more functional diversity into the movement? First of all, say, why do we want to do that?
Yes.
Well, we want to do that because we want this movement to succeed. We want to transform the world. We want to make the world a regenerative place. And we can't do that if we are only doing it with people who look like us and think like us. Right. We're going to be a much stronger, more effective movement if we are more diverse. Diversity brings resilience,
across so many different, and you also, because I've told folks that I care for my mom with Alzheimer's, and you were the first course teacher that said, bring your mother. And even though the sites that we've been to might not have been able to accommodate her, just the fact, and my mother has been an integral part for 7 or 8 years. So there's that piece, but the design of it is taking a little bit of work. So can you just talk a little bit more even of your experiences as we committed to this, what that's been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that bringing in that diversity is really purely selfish because it makes my experience so much more exciting and challenging and sometimes, but enlivening, and also because then I get to meet and hang out with amazing people that I might otherwise not have gotten to meet in a world that often is very de facto segregated. It's not like we have Jim Crow anymore in the US or in the Bay Area. But it's funny, I said Jim Crow and my neighbor Jim just walked in.
See?
Hi, Jim. I'm on the line on a conference, but thank you so much for that. Great. I mean, this is beautiful lettuce that's grown up here. I'll show everybody. It's permaculture.
Ooh,
yeah.
Ooh, tell Jim to send some.
Oh, and grapes. Wow. Thank you.
Muscat of Alexandria and
thank
some
you.
buffalo.
Wow. What a beautiful gift.
Thank you.
Thank you. Where was it? Yeah, it's
okay, go ahead.
We don't have those laws anymore, but what we do have is the norms that people tend to hang out with people like themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that was maybe even more true in my generation than it is now. There's a younger generation that have grown up in schools that are less segregated. When I went to high school, again, it was desegregated, Grew up, went in Los Angeles. But in reality, there were only like 3 black students in my high school. And there were more Mexican American students, but they all hung out together. We didn't mix much. I think there's a lot more chance now for people to develop those functional relationships early in life, and that's really important. I think that's why the younger generations are less prejudiced and more open than some of us in the boomer generation and beyond.
And yeah, I would, that piece, and in some parts, like in the United States, while maybe the teachers or the people with power might still be representing a homogenous group, a lot of the students, a lot of them are just more diverse across all sorts of different ways. And the other thing that you did was you would go outside of your comfort zone and attend things that, again, weren't just your witch community, but that is really a part of why I think Earth activist training has been able to at least to succeed in some way in bringing more people together around the idea of permaculture. And you wouldn't go places spouting, I'm here to talk about my permaculture thing. You would just be, well, you try to be like a little quiet, everybody's like Starhawk, but I've been to places with you where you've really just shown up and been there to support. And I think that's a big lesson for folks today in this world where everybody's like, well, how do we do diversity? It's not a 2-hour training or you said tokenization. It's this investment. And I always say, I actually don't want allies. I don't want people to think of me an ally. I want people to fall in love with me and Black people and want the same ish for me and my family that you want for yourself. I want there to be a deep ingrained feeling of love. That's beyond allyship because you'll do anything for me, and you, Starhawk, you're my sister. Like, I still call you sister, but you're my sister. You're my sister with the A at the end.
Okay. Well, I would say it's not hard to fall in love with you, Pandora. But yeah, it's like when you come out of that world that, where everything is de facto separated, you have to kind of make an effort to do something different. If you just go with what the usual thing is, it's going to stay the usual thing. And again, it's not a sacrifice, it's like a gift to have the opportunity to expand and to meet new people and put yourself in different situations. The other thing is when people start groups like permaculture, something that is challenging the norm, what we often do is we go to our friendship networks.
Right.
And if your friendship networks are all similar to you, then, again, it's not a bad thing. It's not like people want to be, separate and isolated. But again, you don't realize you have to maybe extend yourself a little bit. And then you extend your friendship networks. Then you have like amazing friends, right? Who are incredible. Yeah.
And so now we have Earth activist training. We offer not just permaculture design courses. We sponsor the permaculture teacher training for women. And we, me and Lisa DiPiano have taught now 5 of those. It's now part of the Earth activist training. So speaking about the women's role, we're equipping women to be teachers of permaculture, and if they need, host all women courses. Can you talk about some of the other things that Earth activist training is doing that I feel is really expanding what permaculture is and can be?
We've been doing social permaculture. You and I have taught a lot of those together.
Yes, absolutely.
Looking at how we apply these principles of design to human systems and how we counter some of those. We talk about invisible structures in permaculture and the standard courses around things like economics and land trusts and all that, but we also have to look at those invisible structures like racism and sexism and caste that keep us separated and that actually undermine regeneration on every single level.
And abilities.
Yeah.
about, you've done a lot around designing for multiple abilities to be able to show up in our courses.
Yeah, we have had disabled people. We had one person who's a wheelchair user in one of our courses. We did one live course where we were able to have interpreters through the whole thing and had 4 deaf students. We're doing an online permaculture design course now that is interpreted for the deaf as well as closed captioned. We've done a lot, again, around trying to increase accessibility. And again, sometimes it takes more work. You know, sometimes it's more challenging to think these things out, but it also opens up whole new worlds, and especially for people who are learning design and regeneration.
Right.
I think it's really important to have as many perspectives as you possibly can. You know, it gives you multiple lenses to look at the world and imagine it differently.
And you've also had some of the deaf folks, not just participants, but be seen as experts. I think that's the other reason when you brought me on, even though I was young in permaculture, you didn't just say, just come and I ain't gonna pay you, just be a student and work for me for free. You know, you were like, you know, Pandora, you're already a school teacher. You're already teaching. So can you facilitate, we'll pay you as you're learning. And that felt empowering too, because I was seen and I could afford to do that. And I've noticed you've also done that with deaf communities, with whoever you've been trying to bring in.
Yeah, we, as much as possible, try to, again, bring people in a way where their expertise can shine,
Right.
and they can be seen in that way. We also do a program in regenerative land management. We'd started it, and then COVID-19 threw it into disarray, but we are working on putting it back together in a different form so we can start it up again early next year. And that's designed to be a 2-year program working in connection with PINA, the Permaculture Institute of North America, and with offering a longer term training that goes deeper into permaculture and that will really give people the set of tools and skills they need to get onto a piece of land and bring it back to life and health, whether that's rural land or whether that's in an urban garden setting, community setting, and to do some of the community organizing and relationship building around that.
Right.
With the dream that we will also eventually have an associated land trust, so that, and it's less of a dream, more of a just reality, that we'll have internships and apprenticeships and opportunities for people who go through the program to then get onto the land and really do the work and live the life and be able to make a livelihood while doing it and regenerating land on a large scale. Because in order to deal with climate change, we need to regenerate land, and we also need to regenerate community around it. And I think if we look at the political situation right now in the U.S., the sort of dismal picture we've been facing, you know, a big part of that, I think, is that we are suffering the rage and the despair of rural United States, rural America. And a lot of that rage and despair is being directed into extremely destructive channels.
Right.
But, you know, if we have the opportunity to help people move into regenerative channels, whether that's what they do on their land and also how do we then regenerate rural communities, because farmers can't make a living in this current industrial agriculture model.
Right.
And it's destroying the land, it's destroying communities, it's destroying life, it's destroying health. And we're reaping the rewards of that. But the more that we can regenerate life, the more that we can regenerate people's ability to make a livelihood and their connection to the land and regenerate those communities, then the more we can also develop a political and a social and an economic world that is regenerative on every level, and deal with climate change at the same time.
So with all your work and all of our work with helping eat to actually be funner, like you said, more robust and just everything, how do you understand the permaculture community today? How do you see where we're today? And
well, the permaculture community is really huge and really diverse. So I would first say that, I've been lucky enough to be able to travel up until COVID and go to a number of the convergences, like in Cuba, where we were there together, and in India, and to see that there are amazing projects being done in India, in Africa, in Latin America, around the world by permaculture on a scale that we find hard to conceive of here in the U.S. People are really doing it, and those of us who come out of the U.S. might take a look at that and realize, like, oh, we could be students of what they are doing. We are not like the great white saviors going in with our fantastic knowledge to help the poor, ignorant people in the third world. Like, the third world is way ahead of us on transforming some of these things, and a lot of that comes from indigenous knowledge and wisdom, which has always been an inspiration, always been part of permaculture. In the U.S., I see the movement growing and changing, that there are a real effort to look at how do we decolonize permaculture, how do we broaden it, how do we make it more reflective of the kind of diversity we talk about. And at the same time, there's a wing of permaculture that's more linked with the preppers and the right wing, and we got to go back to the land, like, and form our little enclaves and protect ourselves. And to me, that's not the forward end of permaculture. But I also feel like permaculture and some of the related movements, like holistic management, ranching and grazing, and some of the regenerative farming stuff, it's one of the few places in the U.S. where you could say the rednecks and the hippies actually meet and communicate, and have some shared goals and values, even though we may have widely different other goals and values. And to me, that seems like a potentially fertile edge. I'm deeply, deeply hopeful that we are going to massively vote Trump and all of his friends and enablers out of office. And if any of you are from the U.S. listening, I hope you are voting, have a plan to vote, have already voted, and understand how vitally important it is to do that. Because even if you think that's not enough, it's not. It's still kind of, again, there's a permaculture principle, least change for greatest effect, right? It'd be a lot easier to vote them out now and then push forward in the directions we want to go, than to contend with what will happen if somehow these extreme right-wing forces get another term. So that's happening.
And all our friends in other countries, you might get notes from me and start. Australia, I don't know. I just want some happy Black people wherever I go with some money and resources. So maybe Rwanda, just making my plug. But yes, keep going.
Yes. But that's not enough. Like, when that is done, we still have to contend with the forces and the movements that put Trump in power to begin with. And that means we have to deal with these invisible structures that have shaped the society we're in. And racism is definitely, one of them that has been just an enormous force in the U.S. to keep us from realizing some of the really beautiful ideals we do have and that this country likes to believe we were founded on. And, right? And so we have to find ways of shifting that. And that's a design problem as well as many other kinds of problems. We have to design a world that is not based on the idea that some people are the people of value and other people are expendable.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was very frustrated when I first studied permaculture that the word invisible structures was used, because the economic system feels very visible and like racism is invisible. Many of what things we call invisible structures felt like they were maybe invisible to a few white folks that just decided I don't know who, but they're not invisible. They're very tangent. They've been designed that way. They're doing it like the police force is designed the way it's doing what it was designed to be doing. And so I appreciate you reminding us that there is this potential within permaculture design as a system to really think that through and apply the principles beyond what's been done. I think that's the other, we can't. My talk was nobody's coming to save us. I was like, we are the ones, because again, it's like it's kind of us. And when I have traveled with you too, and I've been like, oh my gosh, I'm so honored to be a part of this global community. But I also really want to support the U.S. in being a little bit more robust and the permaculture community and speaking out a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like you're very vocal. I know you've had times where you've been invited to speak and you've had to say, where's you've really had to be that voice. And I think this is a time for that, to be bold. And we have a community to support us. So I'm wondering, in the fifth sacred thing is an imagined future, which again is what helped college. But we know everything that starts with a seed of imagination and creativity. And just in closing, considering that, what are we imagining into the future? What's the future? And are we able to answer that, Genevieve?
Yes, if you want to continue with that, and then we have a few questions from the crowd as well.
And that's our last question. Thanks, Genevieve.
Thank you so much.
Well, I like to constantly challenge myself to imagine what would the world be like if it were based on different principles. Right. If the overriding principles were the principles of permaculture. Care for the earth, care for the people, care for the future. What would the world be like if we really valued diversity, in our human relations as well as our polycultures and our plants? What would the world look like and feel like? What would our celebrations be? What would our cities look like if regeneration were the key? What would it look like if we really loved children and really wanted them to thrive and grow and live lives that were exciting and to nourish their imaginations? And that has infused a lot of my writing in the Fifth Sacred Thing and its sequel, City of Refuge. But I encourage people to do that as a thought experiment, to maybe think about what's the future you envision and imagine, and then ask yourself, and when I look around at who I'm imagining I'm in this with, do they all look like me? Do they all come from my background? What would happen if I brought in someone who had radically different background or ancestry or needs? How would a world support, if we really cared about integrating, let's say, deaf people into our world? Would we teach everyone ASL from an early age? So that everyone could communicate. If we really cared about integrating our different cultures and our different heritages. Would we teach history, focused on Europe? Or would we teach a much broader vision of history?
Right.
And wouldn't that actually be more enriching for people? And maybe we teach it all in a different way. Maybe we teach kids before we sat them down at desks and told them to keep quiet, keep still. Maybe we teach them how to go out and forage food and how to tell one plant from another and how to grow their food and how to be at home on the earth.
Yeah. Well, sign me up, and wherever that is, me and my mother will be there.
Okay. Your mother's great.
As long as Trump ain't in power, I'll do it in the U.S. too.
Okay, great.
I put my plug again.
Yeah.
Pandora and Starhawk, thank you so much for your presence today. Thank you for the work that you each do in the world. And thank you for giving us a window into this work today through this beautiful, comfortable, intimate dialogue between student and mentor, who I'm sure, Pandora, that you also mentor many people. So there's an amazing lineage going on in that way. And thank you for touching on these crucial issues. And when we really want to look at repair and fostering symbiosis within our own kind, that there's so much work to be done here. So a deep, deep gratitude for this. We have a couple questions from the crowd that we would love to ask. One of them is, how do you see regenerative design come into its strength during COVID time, especially in marginalized communities?
You want to start that off, Pandora?
Okay, I guess because the marginalized.
Yes, yeah.
Ask it again.
How have you seen regenerative design come into its strength during COVID time, especially in marginalized communities? Or how could you see it come into play?
That's actually a good question, because, the word regenerative, again, some could argue that restorative justice is a form of regenerative design. And there's been a lot, because a lot of people are saying that, we've had several pandemics, racism a pandemic. Many also argue that the prison industrial complex is a pandemic. So there's a lot of defunding police and trying to do restorative justice. There's actually, people are not being sent into prison right now because of the outbreaks in places. So there's been interesting organizing in how do we take this moment and do restorative justice. And even one of the young brothers I work with, he has been given chance. He might not have to go back in, and there's this restorative. So in my mind, that means regenerative. Remember the whole words thing, everybody uses the same words. So definitely in our injustice system, many communities are working on that. I also think with this year being a voting year, I'm part of something called the Young Black Climate Leaders. We're training up young Black climate leaders from all across the country. We're using something called Wakanda Dream Lab, which is, because Wakanda, it's actually designed by a white guy, but whatever. Wakanda was this dream place that everybody went to, and we have this idea of this wonderful, inspiring, beautiful place, Wakanda. Again, the systems in Wakanda were way more restorative than the systems when you look in many in the United States right now. So as we're working with the young Black climate leaders, we are doing what Starhawk. We're not stuck in where we are. They're part of this Wakanda Dream Lab where they're dreaming into what does it look like? All those questions Starhawk asked, because for many Black folks right now, we are realizing we spend a lot of time focusing on all those invisible things that we like, race, all this stuff. Imagine if we didn't, we probably would have cured many things by now. But no, we spend all of our time worrying all the shit we do. Excuse my language. Ooh, the shenaniganry. And so with young Black climate leaders, they're dreaming in, they're using Octavia Butler's dystopic future. It's like a similar to Starhawk, her writing, and Wakanda Dream Lab. So that is just restoring our own faith in our own ability and our visioning a future that's not limited to the reality that we face right now. We're also working a lot with Harriet Tubman, and a lot of people across the U.S. right now. I was invited to a Combahee Uprising event. Combahee was the name of the uprising, I think, that took place that Harriet was a part of. And so again, we are trying to channel our ancestors that got through regardless. And that is regenerative because it's not based on the existing stinky systems that are killing us. It's actually infusing the nutrients and the cyclical healing potions that we need and restoring something as we are also waiting for this world to happen. Is that?
Yeah.
Again, I don't like using marginal. I get because again, it's like marginal. We're all but I get the question, but it's very asset based, and we have to start thinking of what do communities have and how are communities already equipped, and that's a large movement right now. A lot of folks I'm working with.
Thank you, Pandora.
I would say in a more pragmatic, prosaic way, like Earth Activist Training, we're doing a permaculture design course online, which is, we put a lot of our stuff online, which is in some ways challenging because we're very hands-on in our teaching, and that's so core to what we do. And you can't really do it in the same way online, but we had to stop and say, well, okay, what are kind of like a niche analysis, like what are the additional needs we have online? What are the opportunities? What are the constraints? And so even though the constraints are making it more challenging to teach the physical stuff, the opportunities are, well, we can reach more people. We can reach people all over the world. We could provide interpretation for the deaf without having, we've done it once in a live course, but we haven't had the funding to do it again because it's tremendously expensive to pay interpreters to go somewhere for 2 solid weeks and be there. So we could do that online, although it's turned out to be challenging in different ways online because the technology isn't really set up to work for the deaf, but we've managed to get around that. We've revisioned our regenerative land management course so that the beginning year of it can be mostly online, and then hopefully by the second year we'll be able to be doing hands-on and in-person stuff again. And we'll probably keep it that way even after COVID because, again, the online part will make it accessible, make it possible for so many more people to do it. And then we'll be able to have a framework where they can get the hands-on in more intense and focused time periods. So it's been a challenge, but it's also been a creative challenge, I think, that's encouraged us to think about things in a different framework.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for that. It's good to know that there are these, out of these very difficult times, even just seeing that restorative justice is being brought in more in places where it should have been in the first place. And that now, because of, it's almost like the inhumane situation within the prisons that already exists, COVID is amplifying and illuminating that and actually creating a side positive situation. So thank you so much for bringing that in. And also, Starhawk, in the way that you're even speaking about the permaculture design principles of how do we bring a permaculture course, which is so hands-on, into the online sphere and apply those same principles, knowing that wherever people are, they have earth beneath them and they need access to this work in this time where people are more distanced. So thank you both for bringing those pieces in. I really appreciate it. So our next question, do you think that the 2-week intensive PDC is the best way to deliver this training? And if not, what time structure have you found to have the best results?
I guess I would say, like everything in permaculture, the answer is, it depends, right? I think I love the 2-week intensive. It offers some stuff that's really hard to do in the same way anywhere else because you develop such an intense bonding and sense of community, and you really have the time and the focus, to work through stuff and to teach people stuff, and it's life-changing. But we're also finding that doing it online has other advantages. I know other people have done weekend courses. We have done that in the past, or done courses in other frameworks. And I think it's good to explore a lot of different frameworks because they're all going to work for different people. A 2-week intensive is going to work really well for some people, but for parents, for people who can't take that kind of time off work, they might never be able to do it. And having something that's on evenings or weekends or online might, again, make it more accessible. We've also we're doing one up at our eco village in British Columbia in the summers, where we would do the PDC in conjunction with a children's permaculture program. It was aimed at families, and that was really exciting. We weren't able to do it obviously this summer, but we are hoping to revive that again someday post-COVID. And again, I encourage people to think about different formats to reach different groups and different people.
Yeah, we did with our Pathways to Resilience, which was a reentry permaculture course. It was five months, but we also had to add enhanced programming. So even the PDC itself wasn't, we had, these were men and women that had just gotten, many of them, some of them were just out of prison, so they needed a wraparound services, some of them needed transportation, there's an opportunity to even design more for the permaculture course itself, let alone just the 2 weeks. And then in our permaculture teacher training for women, we even explored what would it look like to have a course where children could come and be in a room adjacent, or caregiver, so this is a great start opportunity, and it might feel overwhelming, but it's like an opportunity to think of what we have, this amazing framework, we have the 2-week structure, and then what more can we do to allow even more people to access it? And many of the people have the ideas. Like, if we can just actually ask the people we're trying to invite, because mothers have ideas, the formerly incarcerated men and women, they kind of told us what they needed. They might not have all the answers, but definitely, I think that is the perfect question to be having during COVID. And also how to make hands-on, if it is online, what are still some of the home scale activities that people could be doing? And those are probably more social than their land, right? Yeah. People have access to people more than they have acres of land. So I think the opportunity to really apply the social permaculture in the light of COVID in the design will help people start to play with how they're applying the principles in their own lives.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you so much. So we have one last question. It's a bit of a big question, so I wonder if we can just do like an essentialized drop of it again, because we have been so grateful to have you both on the show, and we're getting close with our time. So this question says, love the underlying connections of spiritual understandings with permaculture design. This week, David Holmgren, co-originator of permaculture, said, LSD made it clear to me that there were more things in the human mind that could possibly be comprehended through a simple sort of reductionist method. Can you speak to the role of plant medicines or psychedelics in your own thinking about permaculture, or how they might be used specifically to support people in being effective designers?
Star.
Well, I have to admit, as I said, I was a hippie. LSD definitely had its influence on me in opening up different views of the world, and I would say I probably wouldn't be who I am without LSD. I would also say that if I had carried on taking LSD and other mind-altering drugs, I also wouldn't be who I am. They can open some great doors, but what I found is that as I got deeper into spirituality and magic, it was actually important to kind of get clean and sober, or at least not be dependent on outside agents, and to realize that we have the capability of shifting our consciousness. ourselves. And, maybe we don't get quite in as trippy as you do on an acid trip, but you also don't have that terrible buzzy feeling in the back of your teeth, right? It doesn't go on for 8 hours, even when you're ready for it to stop. Yeah. So I think that it's important, again, in doing permaculture to stay what we call grounded, to stay with your feet on the ground, to look at the real impact of what you're doing and what's happening around you. And with that, to understand people have used plant medicine forever, but they've also used it in some very clear frameworks. And when you take it out of those frameworks, it's very easy to lose the respect and to lose the container that actually makes it more effective.
Right.
So I guess that's my short answer to a deep question.
Thank you. I think that's a very grounding perspective, and to remember to keep our feet on the ground, and that everything in its own moderation, and that finding our sources from within is also very important. Thank you for bringing that in.
Can I switch it over, or can I answer real quick?
But totally.
Because this is making me think, like, part of my purpose, I thought our purpose is reconnecting humans to the non-human world. And it's just so interesting for me to think, like, I could eat a bunch of carrots, and carrots are plant medicine too. But it's just interesting as humans, as we try to do what you're saying, Starhawk, ground even more, that every plant is gifting us something. And there's every plant, Caroline Casey talks about how a lot of times the weeds that grow in front of your home are the actual plants that your body might need to heal. So, you'll see dandelions and nettles, and that these plants are speaking to us. So I would just pray for a relationship where the plant isn't a thing to get people to a point, but it's another part of that continuum of relationship based. And there can be too much, but also there's probably a role. I don't personally partake in it, because y'all can already see I'm kind of already whatever I am. But there's lessons to be learned from so many. And I do think that there's an opportunity now to have relationships that are based in respect and not over harvesting and because it feels like even that might be happening with plant medicine.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate having you both here and sharing your wisdom. This has been incredible, and you both gave very grounding drops to end out this informative, inspiring dialogue. And again, thank you. It's such an honor to have you on the program today, and we will hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Love you all so much. Bye.
Bye. Love you.
Oh my goodness, so much has been learned in this short period of time. Such an honor to have them both on. You can find more of Pandora's work at pandorathomas.com and also blackpermaculturenetwork.org. You can find more of Starhawk's work at starhawk.org and earthactivisttraining.org.